Bonjour, miigwech. My English name is Harry Bone. My traditional names are two of them. Our Anishinaabe people are usually given two names, one to connect with the Creator and the universe, and the other one to reflect the land and the animals in the plant world. So my first name, of course, is a reference to Jesus. Jesus is a reference to my first name. Second name is Turtle. It's a clan. Turtle is my clan. So that's my first two traditional names, Northern Anishinaabe names. I was raised at the Kishkwanian First Nation, and I was raised by my grandparents. As people would know that, my mother died upon birth, so I was raised in the 50s and 60s. The reason why I say those things, because in the 50s, our people were starting to very openly discuss about their treaties, about their ceremonies, about our languages, about our teachings. I grew up, understanding what the ceremonies were about: sun dances, sweat lodges, shaking tents, the Medaiman teachings, and the pipe teachings, and the feasts that we do. So I grew up with that in the 50s and 60s. I'm often known as speaking the language fluently because that's my first language for the first 7 years of my life until I started school. I started school, when I was 7 years old, and then also too that I didn't attend residential schools for two reasons. One of them is my mother died, came home from residential schools very sick and very abusive, so she didn't last very long. Just 1 year after she arrived in the reserve. The other reason is in 1951 we had the option to go to schools if there was a school close by. And our chief at that particular time, his name was Robin Blackbird, was very adamant, very, very strong that, he didn't want to send kids anymore to schools, residential schools. So, then he pushed for that, so me and his son were the first Anishinaabe students at, the non-Indigenous school close by there, next to Kishkwanian First Nation, a town called Elphinstone. So I attended school there, the elementary school and high school, went to university later on. So that's my brief background. I was raised there, in the 50s and 60s. Things are different in those areas. There was no band offices. There was no welfare. Everything that we did was through our own sweats, our own, the way we do things. It was a nice environment. So I always feel that I was fortunate to have raised in that particular time. So that's my beginnings. But I'm from Treaty 2 area. The Treaty 2 is probably in the western part of, the northern Manitoba, the central part. Treaty 2 was signed shortly after the Treaty 1 was signed. Treaty 2 was signed at the northern, just south of Evanflow. It's called northern. There's a post there that was there, like Hudson Bay Post. So the Treaty Commissioner came across Lake Manitoba and signed treaties with us. My chief, Kishkwanian was the one that was actually implemented the treaty, but Mikis was the one that signed the treaty. He was still alive when the treaty was made, in 1871. So he was the one that attended, that meeting at the Manitoba Post. So he agreed to sign, but he died before the year was over. So his brother Kishkwanian, took over the reins, took over as chief. So that's the way the reserve was named after Kishkwanian First Nation. Our rules are very important. There's a bit of a criteria that you use to describe who is an elder, not because they're getting old, but there are a number of things that an elder is usually one that can still speak the language fluently. And our language is Anishinaabe language. And understands our history, and understands our ceremonies, and understands the way we did things in the past. So it's a historian, is somebody that understands our history backwards. There's a big difference between our perspective, what knowledge, what who we are, the Western perspective. So that's always been very, very important. But our languages and the way we do things, the way we do our ceremonies, identifies who we are. is important. So that's why elders are important, even to this day, the elders of today and the elders before us and the elders that were used 150 years ago. It's their experience in their lives and the way they did things. So I think, their experience, their history, their knowledge is very, very important. There's different categories of elders. There's elders that can do ceremonies, and then there's ones that can do the special ones, like Shaking ceremonies, sun dances, so forth. But there's also elders that can do healing, specifically healing. Whether the person is sick or whatever that sickness that they may have. There's also elders that understand the medicines, from the plant world, and how to collect the medicines, So I think, what's important, then there's also the elders, that were able to, conduct, the ceremonies, through songs, through ceremonies and the pipe ceremonies, that kind of stuff. So there's different type of elders, an elder doesn't not be inclusive, but there's a specialist in our field. So I think, some people are knowledgeable about, a number of things, especially the healing part and the medicines and spiritual teachings. So I think we have gifted elders for that. But most elders, would understand about their knowledge, are able to talk about it, as I am, because I was raised with my language, and the ceremonies that we have. So I think, the elders at the time of treaty is very critical, because that was their knowledge, that was their experience. Because when the treaty was made 150 years ago, we still had our nation status, we still had who we are as people, and we still had the military presence, and we still had the population. So the treaties were based on equal footings. So as you probably know, if you understand treaties 1 and 2, and there were ceremonies that were done at the time just prior to the signing of treaties. And the reason for that is because then we seek the guidance, to make sure that what we're doing reflects our past, connects us today, and then make sure that our future is secured. So that's why the ceremonies were done at that particular time. So I think what's important is the elders' perspective, and we still understand what was done 150 years ago, the languages for our people. So I think for me personally, I like to give credit to my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1880, just at the time of treaties were made. But the reason why that's important, because she was a young woman that time when she heard, how important, the treaties were, how important, our languages were, how important our teachings and who we are is important to him. Because she often says that, what she was taught, if someday you lose the Anishinaabe language, you lose your thought, you lose the way you do things, you'll have to depend on someone else's language, their values and their belief systems to try and explain who you are. So that's why, the challenge at time was, they're quite aware 150 years ago, are people that other people are going to come from across the great ocean to come and settle. Then they'll have their own systems, they'll have their own languages, their own way of worship, their own way of doing things. So make sure that we understand ours. Because if we don't understand our teachings, if we don't understand our languages, our ceremonies, then someone else is going to take over us. And in fact, that's the reason why that happened to us. But we still maintain who we are as elders. I think that's why it's important that we speak to elders, because of their knowledge about their history. We referenced the time before treaty was made, before 1871. I think that's important, because that's our source of who we are. We understand that we as First Nations were here first, so we must recognize that. And we were regarded as having our own, presence as people and as nations. I think that's very, very critical, because we had the equality to deal with the government at that particular time. So I think the population, we are superior 150 years ago. So the non-Indigenous people were in a minority. So that's why that it's understand. We also still had the military might, so before treaties. We were still very much involved. Another thing that, of course, we had the political presence of our people. I think that's important as well. We also know that, we had rights before the treaty time, on legal rights. The legal rights, of course, the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And we had, political rights, the Treaty of Niagara, just before treaty was made. And also, we also know what is our contribution as First Nations to nation building prior to Canada, what it became. You have to understand the English and French wars. You have to understand, our role in the American Revolution. I think, then our greatest contribution at that time was, of course, to create the first block at, where Niagara Falls is now, when the Americans wanted to come back, invade Canada, take over. So First Nations were really involved to protect Canada at that time. So that contribution is important. So that's why, we need to understand, that historical part as well. But the other thing that we must understand too, like, we still had special connection to the land. The land is our source of who we are. We still had, a special relationship to land. So that's why land rights, were very important. So that was before treaty. So we had all these things. We had people with, our teachings. We are nations, equal to any nation at all. And then we had, the first access to the land. We were the first owners of the land. So at the time of treaty. So the other thing to remember is, the treaty was agreed to without war, without, going to war. Like, so our people often say that we were never defeated and we were never surrendered and we never give up anything. Treaties were negotiated on equal basis, nation to nation. And that's still very much alive today. And we still retain that status. Because at the time of treaty, when Canada became a country in 1867, we're the only group of people that are mentioned in the Constitution, Section 191(24). It simply says Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So we have, the constitutional rights that protects us, who we are as First Nations people. So that's important, to remember those things, because the government, tries hard to erase those kind of things. So when the treaties were signed, they were negotiated, on equal basis. We agreed to share this great land, because people from all over, people are going to come, especially in Western Canada. Treaties 1 to 11 were signed in Western provinces. At the time, the then Prime Minister was interested in, sending immigrants to come and settle here. So immigration was very, very important. So that's why they wanted to land. But also, the railway was also very important because there were two objectives that the federal government had at that time. To bring people to Western Canada for settlement. Secondly, to build a railway to the Great Ocean to make sure that they had the sovereignty from coast to coast. So that is important. So that. The pipe ceremony was important. Was used at a particular time because of the basic teachings about our pipe ceremonies is it's one of the sacred instruments that we used to demonstrate who we are as people and as nations, because it represents what we call in our language and the way the pipe is sacred cardinal points in our lifetime. 7 cardinal points, as everybody knows, whether pipe ceremonies. We believe in one creator for all of us, no matter if you're Dakota, you're Cree, you're Dani, you're Anishinaabe, we all believe that we have one creator for all of us. So that's the first belief. So we honor that with our pipe ceremonies. All the environment, the Mother Earth, as we call it, the Turtle Island, gives us all, the necessary, gifts of life, to live, in a sensible way. So I think, those two really belief systems is still very, very important because in the eyes of the Creator, all of us, no matter where you came from, where eyes equal. And we are blessed, with certain things. Anishinaabe people were blessed, with our languages, our thoughts, the way we do things. And we are blessed with our teachings, whether they're pipe ceremonies, whether it's Sundance, sweat lodges, the Medevian teachings, and all the teachings that go with it. But it's also taught us where we come from. Our elders often tell us that to understand where you're going to go, you have to understand where you came from. And that from is from our elders. the ones that have passed on to the next world. They left their knowledge and their experience and their teachings behind them. So we have the responsibility to pick them up, to make sure understand where we came from, our history. And also tell that we have a way of doing things. It's called way of life. It's our journey. In English terms, it's called government. So I think, those 7 sacred directions were used at the time of treaty. That's to exercise, what the treaty meant to us. That's why, those words, the northern spirit intent of treaty is important, because that's what reflects that. As you probably know that, the government of the day, even today, only looks at the written part of the treaty. And that written part was from their perspective, from their way that what they thought the treaties were negotiated. But the other balance is from our perspective. Our perspective is those 7 sacred teachings I was just telling you, our languages, our teachings, and the way we do things, and the way that we conduct ourselves in terms of who we are as people. So I think at the time of treaty, these are very important things. I want to just say that this is important, because even our leaders do make reference, why that's important. Our rights did not come from the Constitution, from a Canadian law or in place else. Our laws and who we are as people came from us through our languages, through our ceremonies, through our way that we conduct. So that's why that we had a special relationship to the land, and even today. So one of the things that we negotiate, of course, in land, transfers, when we agreed to share this land, was hunting rights, fishing rights, medicine rights, that kind of stuff, to live off the land, and to make sure that we have that, inclusive territory to include, where the animal goes, wherever the water goes. We had those rights retained. There was no boundaries at that particular time, and neither do they think there's a boundary today. We can hunt, in the time we want, in place. That is one of the truly things that we talked about, because that's how we lived in the past. That's how we lived at that particular time. And we're still living that way, to live off the land, because we still have the water, we still have the air, we still have animals share, we still have medicines. So I think, that's important, at that particular time when we said these things are what's going to be done. So I think, the treaty rights, they're not actually rights, but they're treaty things that we agreed, at the treaty time was simply those, and those 7 principles is a source of who we are based on our nationhood. That's our creator, that's our land, that's our people, our languages, our teachings, our history, and the way we do things. Every time we do that pipe ceremony, every time we do that prayer in our languages to reflect those 7 directions, it's a declaration who we are. It's our constitution. It's our law. See, in other words, we base our teachings on those 7 sacred parts, because so is the crown. The crown has similar sacred points. We made a reference about who they are as nations. So I think for us, at the time of treaty, we exercise those things about who we are. Because we did that, 150 years ago at the time of treaty, before then, we based our history on that, and we still maintain to this day, how we conduct ourselves, what in our ceremonies. Although that not many of our people now still follow those, but we retain the rights that were negotiated at the time of treaty. Because at the time of treaty, we did not ask for welfare. We asked for equal rights, equal opportunity, and to use the land the way that is suitable for us. We asked our rights, to the right to education, the right to health, the right to any right that anybody has. So at the time of treaty, so that's why that treaty is important. Shortly after treaty in 1876, the federal government introduced a legislation called the Indian Act in 1876. The Indian Act has nothing to do with treaties, has nothing to do with the original rights of our people. The Indian Act merely was established to civilize and to control and to manage First Nations people. That's why they controlled. A very important part about the Indian Act is about citizenship. The government decides who should be an Indian, who should be a Métis, who should be non-status, and who should be others. They decide. But we maintain that right to be who we are as citizens. And so we practice that, all this time as But as a result of the Indian Act in 1876, shortly thereafter, they established residential schools. And as you probably know, the purpose of residential schools was simply to take away our languages, to take away our teachings, our ceremonies, and most important, to take away our family connections, the way that we were raised by our parents and grandparents and mothers and fathers. That family relationship was disturbed because ever since we were 5 years old, we were taken away to residential schools for 10 months at a time. And the reason for that is because the federal government at that time thought it's important that our people become like them, to civilize us, to make sure that we fit into their system. So that's reasons why the Indian Act had a negative effect. You only have to look at the Indian Act ever since it was established in 1876 to 1951, over the period of time. Some key points, of course, I just want to mention them. The rights, as political organizations in 1920. The reason why that's important because our people, First Nations people, had gone to First World War. So when they were going to war, they were treated as equal status. But when they arrive in Canada, they're back, to the reserve system, second-class citizens. So organizations were formed, especially by the person by the name of Fred Loft. He was the Mohawk. He traveled across Manitoba, across Western provinces to organize our people. And by the way, that Frank Loft was in my community in 1920. They had a big chiefs meeting there. At that particular time, people from Saskatchewan and Alberta were there to hear him with a political organization. That political organization was merely to create one voice, one unity for First Nations across. That was the purpose for that. So as a result of that, shortly after that, the 4 journeys that he made to Western Canada, the government amended the Indian Act. It was now against policy, against law, to assemble, to working together like that. So see, in other words, the government still that 1920 still had the upper hand in deciding how to shape the law, how to shape policy. The other part that's important is 1930, the Natural Resources Transfer Act. We weren't consulted, we weren't told, so that's why that NRTA is still on shaking grounds, and because our people still have the right to the natural resources, that are from the far north of our provinces. So I think it's important, that we maintain our rights as they were. We go backwards. The legal system now protects us. Now, the Supreme Court decisions have been made in our favor. Now we have, lawyers, even from our own perspective, who can protect us, from make sure that these things were done. But I just want to make sure that shortly after that, the government did everything to make sure that we fall under their jurisdiction, we fall under their control. So I think what's important, but in 1940s, the federal government, especially the Senate, they started to say, what about these Indian people? So there was a discussion. So that's why the Indian Act was amended in 1951 to provide, some rights that all Canadians were entitled to, like family allowance, old age pension, the right to vote, the right to speak for ourselves, and the right to choose our own school where we want to go, that kind of stuff. So we were able to get, and another thing too that we were able to do that, of course, in the 70s, that's the ones I made reference at the beginning, then I was raised in the 50s and 60s. So then our people were very much entitled and practiced, at least my area, about our traditions, about our ceremonies, who we are as people. And because when I was growing up, the community was very, very positive, very friendly and very loving community. There was no violence. There was no, political organizations. There's no people who are playing politics. Because we learn all that, the things that we do now to disrupt our processes and reserves, from the Indigenous people, from the government. We never operated in those kind of bases. So I think for all of us, those are the days of the days after the treaty. But I think, there's a big distinction. What needs to happen, you have to understand our history from our perspective, not the Western perspective, not their thoughts, from ours. So that's why, it's so important now that, now we have young academics now coming along to understand, our side, our perspective, not somebody else's. So I think, that's really important now, that's happening now. Now we establish that process at the time of treaty, and we still remind the government, of the rights that they agreed to, their obligations, their responsibilities. They still have legal perspective, legal responsibilities for us. They undercut us, they underfund it, they underdo other things. That's why their program and services are the way they are now. Anishinaabe language is so key for us, in our existence. The language of our people is the first right that we have. So it's important that the language of our people is still maintained and is still, understood. I know that, today most young people don't speak their languages, but, we always say to young people, as long as you know that, who we are as people, as nations, whether you're Anishinaabe or others, your rights came through our languages. So in other words, it's our first right, what the Creator has given to us is through our languages and through our land connection and who we are as people. So I think that's important, that language is so important because see, 150 years ago, they recognized, the federal crown recognized how important the language is. So that's the first thing that they wanted to take away from us. Once they take away their language, they can control us. Because as my grandmother said, if you ever lose your language, you're going to lose how to think like Anishinaabe, how to do things like Anishinaabe, what the Creator has given to you. You have to use the English language to try and identify your identity, your connection to the Creator, your connection to the original rights. In other words, you've already given up your right, to exist, and you have to depend on somebody else. So that's why it's so important. People don't really recognize that the language is so important because that's our original right. That's who we are as First Nations people. But I say to young people, and we all say to young people as elders, even if you don't speak your language today, the thing to remember is as long as you know that our original rights of our people came through our languages, because through our ceremonies, that kind of stuff. So I think for all of us, then we have to recognize that our rights came from, the languages that we speak. So that's why language, today, the Anishinaabe language, the languages for our people is key. Like even the word Anishinaabe is actually a sentence. Simply means that, Lord to Mother Earth. So we came from someplace that the Lord is, from the Creator. So we believe in one Creator. That's why, the Anishinaabe is, we have different names, of course, Ojibwe, First Nations, the nations, so all kinds of other names. Anishinaabe is the original word of our people, and that's what we like to use. So I think, I just want to stress that language is a key. That's why now we still have that objective to try and teach our people back to the languages and them back to know who we are, because the words of Anishinaabe words are actually sentences. If you drag all the words that we use in our languages, it's actually a sentence. So originally it's like Anishinaabe, Oneshawewin, Anishinaabe, and today, we talk about Indigenous law. In our language, it's called Anishinaabe, Oneshawewin. So if you use those words, it simply tells us how the law is shaped, where it came from. So I think, that's why languages are important. And the government and the Crown recognize this. So that's why, the residential schools were introduced to take away the language, to take away the Indian Act, to take away, our languages. We have a lot of confidence in our youth because now they're starting to recognize the importance of what language, because if you don't know your language, then they often tell us then you have to use English language. Someone else's belief system, someone else's values, someone else's the way they think to try and identify who we are as people. And that's the mess that we have now here today, because most people just don't know who they are, don't know their identity, don't know their original rights, their connection to the Creator. So I think, for all of us, that language is so important. Relationship is so important, to make sure that, the justice is done to the law history of our Canada. And because, that treaty was based on First Nations lands, First Nations ownership of the lands, First Nations who we are. Treaties were made on those bases. So I think, the there's false assumptions that are made that Canada was two founding nations, French and English. See, that's the, and also the misconception about how Canada law became into shape. The doctrine of discovery is based on papal bulls. That simply said that North American was an empty land. We weren't people, that kind of stuff. So that's why that treaty relationship is so important, because we have to come on our strength from our languages, from our own ways. Now that relationship now is becoming onto the scene. Today now, they have a term now, that you hear all the time called reconciliation. So what does reconciliation means? They tell us, the reconciliation in Latin form simply means, to sit together for peace. Just what the treaty was about 150 years ago. But for us, as Indigenous peoples, Anishinaabe people, we need to reconcile with our Creator. We need to reconcile with our teachings, our ceremonies. We have to reconcile with our languages. We have to reconcile the original, the part of our people, and we have to go backwards to make sure that we do that. And I think on the government side, on the Crown side, for Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, they have to reconcile how this great country was built on, where they come from. Yet they have to reconcile their own history, especially the government, especially the law. The law is made on assumptions, the doctrine of discovery, on papal bulls, and greatest thinkers like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, those guys, that shaped the thought how Canadian law, Canadian constitution to be established. So I think, it's all false assumptions, because they're all lies. If you study what they did, they merely, wanted to control us, because they introduced those forms like superiority, inferiority. They were superior, they were inferior, and they did great lengths to make sure that we are inferior. But we're not today. The government understands that. We have voices now. We still practice our languages. We still practice our traditions. We still practice our ceremonies. We have those rights. Now, even the Supreme Court decisions are in our favor. They establish, the oral history of our people is a legal right. So I think, for all of us, that relationship has to be done on equal basis as they were 150 years ago, or even before then. So I think that treaty relationship is so important now. But knowing that, then it's easy to say, but also our leaders, our people, to have understand what that treaty means to us, what it really means, what that relationship is all about. That relationship is, we never agreed to abusive relationship. We never agreed, to the mess that we have now. We never agreed to the welfare system, that undermines our dreams of equality, of hopes. That's not the relationship that we had asked. The relationship that we have here today is most young people can have. Their right to education, to be educated to whoever they want to be, whether they want to be a lawyer, an educator, that kind of stuff. They have a right to make sure that they have a contribution, they have a job, their hopes, make sure that they have all those things. So that's what the relationship is all about. Now we're starting to restore that. The government has got no choice. They don't have a legal perspective. They don't have the legal right to do away with us. Neither do they have the political right to do that. And lastly, they don't have the moral right to just to leave us alone. So that's why that relationship is so important. That's why it's used loosely by the federal government. Nation to nation. They try to find what is a nation. But if you look at what I've been talking about, those 7 sacred points, our nation, our sovereignty, our constitution is based on our ceremonies and our teachings. So I think that treaty relationship is very, very much alive, and is the beginning of our hope, and to make sure that we have that equal status, equal justice, just like anybody else. So that's why that treaty relationship is still very much talked about. He's starting his journey. So that's why we have the hope of young people. Take a look at the universities and colleges, where young people are starting to understand what our true history is all about. Just lastly, I just want to say that we had a good session here with the elders. A young guy of Aaron Mills, who studied Indigenous law, is an expert on Indigenous law. He's got a doctorate degree in Indigenous law, that knows the difference between Indigenous law and Western law. So see, in other words, we're now at equal status about knowing what law is all about. So I think, we have hope in young people into the future. In fact, that's why the Treaty Commission was established, to make sure that, that we revive our history in a way that it should be done in a true sense of equality and hope and dreams. So, Mikach.